Welcome, everybody. We have a very special treat for you this week. I've been wanting to do this. We're going to talk about digital trouble. Digital addictions. Is your phone, your computer, your iPad part of the evil ruler that is stealing your attention and stealing the attention, really stealing the pleasure centers of your children? With us is Dr. Lisa Strohman. I'm so excited to have her. She's a clinical psychologist, an author, public speaker, and the founder and director of Digital Citizens Academy, which you can learn more about at dca.org. She established Digital Citizen Academy to proactively prevent and educate students, educators, and parents on the issues resulting from technology use and misuse. Dr. Strohman has spent more than a decade working with adolescents and families in her private practice and working with schools to address the challenges with student mental health, which is just getting worse and worse. She was a visiting scholar for the FBI, working on homicidal pedophilia when a Columbine occurred, giving her the opportunity to be on the front lines of how technology impacts our youth. She has continued to work with law enforcement and the FBI on safety and cyber crimes involving adolescents, while also lending her knowledge and guidance to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Lisa, welcome to the Brain Warriors Way podcast.
Thank you for
having me.
So how did you get involved in this?
It was a little bit happenstance, I would say. It was where I was in grad school. I was doing a law psychology program. At the same time, I applied to be an honors intern at the FBI and was placed into this unit where this is pre 9/11. So it was this unit that was all profilers. So we did child abduction and serial killer work. And it was awful, I will have to say. I mean, you're seeing pretty much the worst of the worst. But my mentor at the time was a workplace, school-place violence expert, and he was becoming a very good friend of mine and was really helping me along in this kind of vast space of bad people that exist in the world. When, unfortunately, that's when Columbine, the tragedy in Colorado, happened. And I was front and center to see NSA and CIA and all of the FBI obviously come together and look at what these two young men had done and had posted about pre-cell phone, pre-iPad, pre-technology for 17 months. And I remember being in my 20s and thinking, where were the adults? Like, why did we miss this? This is technology. This is the ability to find things where people are posting online, and we missed it. And I remember thinking that somebody has to do something about it. And that's how I got into this field of understanding and looking at the psychology and technology and how they interplay with each other.
It's so true.
Say a little bit more about how technology impacted Columbine. I find this so interesting. You know, when bad things happen, it's easy to call those boys bad, and what they did was evil. The harder question is to go, well, why? So that we can learn more about it. I actually had the opportunity to get the scans for Kip Kinkle. Kip was the mass shooter the year before Columbine. Based on my work, they scanned him in Portland, and he had such a damaged brain. And he'd seen psychologists, he'd seen psychiatrists, he'd taken Prozac and Ritalin, but nobody looked at his brain. And so, you know, I try to champion, you have to look at their brains, because how do you know what they do? But there's so many other factors. And maybe if you could just talk a little bit about technology and the Columbine Killers, that would be interesting.
Enlightening,
and helpful.
Yeah, I think what I see in these situations is that you do have these troubled kids, and whether it's early trauma or whether there's something that's going on in their life that you particularly have this like open, unique window to be able to see that the rest of the world doesn't get, and they've never. It's this science that some people don't understand that we have. So the psychology of looking at behaviors and consequences is what we typically only have to look at. And when I looked at these two young men, Klebold and Harris, they definitely had this ability to have been intervened upon through law enforcement because they had been arrested almost a year prior, had been collecting bottles and like looking to do things. And so they had some contact with law enforcement. So there's already an incident there that we, in my, of course, hindsight 2020, like was missed to do an intervention. And one of the parents knew about the kind of obsession with guns and things like that. But where technology comes in is MySpace at the time was akin to, say, their Instagram or our Facebook, or, where they could go in and they could post, they could write, they could pontificate on their ideas and what they were going to do. And what it gave back, which is what happens with us even today, and the same challenges we're having today, is that it creates a silo of people who believe in you and believe in what you're doing, and they're encouraging you in ways that a biased or a disturbed mind would read into. And so that's what I saw, is that this is a very minute population, but they're coming in and they're like, yeah, you should stick it to the man, or you should do this. So that information that they were getting was very, very untethered and not sound advice, but that was feeding them continually. There's nobody coming in to the contrary.
That's so interesting. And one thing you said that I really like, you talked about where are the parents? I've had that thought so many times. So we have a 16-year-old. She homeschools now, but she went to a very large high school in our area. And it was really interesting to me. We're very close. So I'm a part of her social media quite frequently. We'll sit down and she'll show me stuff on her Snapchat. Okay, so there are these venues where kids can post and parents can't really see it because it disappears, right? So we've got all these different things. But she would show me what's going on. And it's one of the reasons she wanted to homeschool, because things were getting out of control at school. She felt like the social scene was so intense. This is in 8th grade. I'm seeing her Snapchat where there's these massive parties and they're showing, these little Snapchat images of her friends doing drugs, or they're passed out in a pizza box because they've drank so much and they're throwing up, and one girl got drugged. And I'm like, where are the parents? Why is this happening? It's 8th grade. Where are the parents? And my daughter laughed. She said, Mom, she said, the parents at that party, they hired a bouncer because they weren't going to be there. A bouncer? I'm so confused. But right there, like to your point, there is indication that there's trouble. There is trouble. That's trouble. And there's no parents. And when they do find out, because I saw this happen a lot, when they would find out, when there's a fight that happens at a football game because of intoxication, or a girl ends up in the hospital in an alcohol-induced coma, it's whitewashed. It's, oh, they're kids. It's a rite of passage. And that's confusing to me. I don't really understand, like, what's going on with the adults in that situation, in all of those situations. Why are people not doing more?
I would say in this situation that particularly in those settings, like I look at a cell phone or a device, personal device for kids, it's like a cloaking device for them, right? They can use hashtags, they can send addresses, they can drop pins, all of these things on apps that are like Snapchat, like you said, disappears. By the way, to everyone except for law enforcement, because I would say 95% of the cases that I see evidence on is from Snapchat. So what I educate kids on is it doesn't disappear forever, and it is out there, and they are holding that information on servers, and they need to recognize and understand that is evidence against them in colleges, in first employment, exactly, in crime cases. So and to the parent issue in hiring a bouncer, and if they think that that's washing their liability, I will tell parents right now, and this might be the most important things your listeners hear. Like, you would never let your child probably go out on a motorcycle without a helmet. You wouldn't let them go out without a bike, because you're protecting that. The most important part of their being is their brain, their ability to think for themselves and manage their life. But yet we hand them a device that we know creates brain damage. We hand them a device that allows them to cloak and hide that they're doing pill parties and drug and alcohol. And all the meanwhile, you as a parent are completely liable. It is your cell phone. It is your policy. It is your contract. So if your child sends a death threat, if your child gets in trouble, if they're selling drugs online, that comes back to your liability. And I've seen countless parents have to go into their umbrella policies and their homeowners policies and pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for that. So it's terrifying to me. I don't know how to spread the message louder and faster. I mean, this is always helpful to have these conversations, but you're right to be totally terrified by this.
It's amazing to me, because there is no such thing as washing your hands of liability when you have a child. that concept.
Well, I think most parents don't think about it.
They may not know.
And we are supervising children less than ever before in human history, because at least here in California, 90% of moms work outside the house. And it's not a statement on that, but God gave you parents to be your child's frontal lobes until theirs develop. And theirs actually don't finish developing until they're in their middle 20s. Mm-hmm. And we're giving these kids devices at 7, 8, 9, 10 when their brains aren't developed, and these devices addict them, and they're actually created purposefully to addict them. There's a great book on this called Hooked, and it's basically how do you create addictive gadgets. And so when we come back, I want us, Lisa, to talk a little bit about the history of how technology has changed over the last 30 years. And over the course of this week, we'll talk about some very specific things parents can do about it. Stay with us.
Welcome back. We are still here with our amazing guest, Dr. Lisa Strohman, and she's got a great book, Unplug. We've been talking about devices and the effect on the brain, especially with children. So this has been really fascinating to me, and we want to talk about how gadgets have changed. How have you seen them change over the last 30 years?
Wow, that's a big, tall order. A lot has happened in the last 30 years. First of all, we have created such small microcomputers today that we can basically walk around with a processing unit in our hip pocket that's more powerful than the computers that we had in governmental agencies 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. So we think that magnitude and the shift between how much data we can process, how quickly we can process it, and how accessible it is probably the most important part in that change that's happened, because it's given access to everyone.
So you basically have everything at your fingertips all the time. And this is also with kids. Most parents don't put controls on their phones.
So let me tell a story. When I was growing up, which was a lot longer ago than you guys, we really had typewriters and you'd write things by hand. And I just published a book this year called Change Your Brain, Change Your Grades. Well, the first version of that I wrote in 1982. Longhand. I actually wrote it longhand, and it was such a wonderful process, but I hated editing it. Mm-hmm. And that's when the personal computer just came out. And I asked my dad for $1,700 so I could get a Sanyo personal computer. They had little floppy disks, mm-hmm. And it changed my life in a good way. I could edit it. Right. My productivity went way up.
Yeah, sure. There's good and bad. Obviously, we have a lot of great things with technology. We just have to be careful.
But in 1987, when my oldest son, Anthony, was 10, Atari came into the house. Mm-hmm. I was stationed in Barstow in the middle of the Mojave Desert, and he had been a really good student. And now when Atari came, he was not a good student anymore. And he and I started fighting about it because he couldn't stop. Because initially I'm like, this game is so cool. I didn't have games like that when I was a child, and I thought it was so cool. But I could see its addictive quality. And also being a child psychiatrist, I just finished my child psychiatry training. I went, these things are bad for children because they can addict them. And that's with the old, video games that would do ping, pong, right? I mean, they were completely boring. And since then, it has just gone exponentially crazy where you can play these 3D games on your phone that totally wear out the pleasure centers in your brain. So they actually purposefully addict them, wear out the pleasure centers, and they're stealing.
It's amazing.
The attention of our children.
Dr. Strohman, are you familiar with the work of Colonel David Grossman?
I have, yes.
On combat.
I've heard of
So I read that book. I mean, it's weird that I read it, but I read it more from a martial artist standpoint. but the part in there that stuck out to me that I actually brought into one of our books and I talked to Daniel about that I thought was fascinating was when he actually talked about video games and the violence in video games and how it's affecting the youth and how it was so effective with like school shooters and kids who had never picked up a weapon. They pick up a weapon, they walk in, they can hit a moving target perfectly. And it didn't make any sense because law enforcement trains and they can't do that, right? It's very difficult to do. And how, because of that, the military had adopted the Atari, because you brought up Atari, they adopted that technology to train military, to train police officers. I thought that was fascinating. Do you know anything about that?
I do. I think that a lot of parents don't recognize, that there's differences in video gaming, right? So there's nonviolent, there's violent video gaming. When you put in an escalation where you're putting in a first-person shooter or you're teaching kids, it is that fight or flight mechanism in the brain, and Dr. Amen would talk to that more to that. But what you see is that brain basically gets in this hyper-vigilant state, and the fear that I have and what I see with kids is there's such a desensitization that happens over time. So I was on a national board for the American Psychological Association. I was on this commission that looked at violent video games. And I want to say that probably everyone that was actually on the committee was over the age of 65. And none of them had ever played these video games. And so I remember sitting in the room and I said, have any of you actually played Grand Theft Auto, right, or have you played Halo? No. So they're looking at this in these like micro moments instead of like really understanding what it is like for these kids to jump in to a video game, get shot. Fortnite is a perfect example, right, of a more recent one where you can shoot someone, you can hide from someone, and then if you get killed, there's no blood. So what message is that sending to the kids from a psychological perspective? Yeah. Right. And then can you ghost them? Right. So if somebody kills you, now you can actually follow and float through the game with the person that you just killed. Right. And you can, and you can, depending on like what messaging that you're using, you can talk to them and harass them the entire time. So the psychological and emotional warfare on top of just the play is so massive. And I think that parents don't understand. For instance, Discord is the app is 98 million kids strong. Like that's a lot of people on a gaming platform app that's outside of Xbox, PlayStation, Atari, right? It is outside of even the platform so that these kids can have private conversations and communicate with one another.
Right. They're conversing. Yeah. And the thing is what you said is so interesting because these are kids with developing brains, which is what you've been trying to say. These are not adults who already have that are already developed and have their moral compass set, who are already pretty set in their ways. These are kids who are very impressionable.
And 9 out of 10 teenagers in the UK have no purpose. So if you put these devices that change your brain into the heads of kids who have no purpose, their purpose is to just play the game. And can you help us though with what does the research really say about devices and video games for children? Because, I mean, I have this mindset, this is a bad idea. But you'll hear periodically research come out that says, oh, no, it's really good for them. They're learning new skills. They're becoming more dexterous. Although I read one study where the thumb representation in the brain has become larger since these video games, and that's good if you're a monkey. It may not be good if you're not a monkey. But could you just help us? Where's the research today on the impact of technology and violent video games on developing brains?
The research is extremely clear that violent video games creates damage in a negative way to kids. It creates a higher anxiety, it creates higher depression, and it also, to your point, morphs the brain and aggrandizes those areas of the brain that give you the potential to be more aggressive, less empathetic, all of the things that you do not want your child to be in these developing periods of time. The challenge with the research, and I use air quotes around the research in that sense, is that some of the research that comes out that gets presented to me. So I'm in the middle of a talk and I'm talking about technology and the impact on the brain, and here's the realities. And somebody said, well, there was just a study at UCI that stated that it's not really that bad. So I said, well, I'd like to see who sponsored that research. I'd like to see who they asked. And of course, they asked 10 to 15-year-olds, hey, do you feel bad after you use your device? And did they not only start with 2,000 kids, they published the results of only 366 of them. And it's self-report. That is not science. That is not something that should go out and hit mainstream media and say, oh, by the way, it's really not as bad for their brains. Totally different. And so you can speak to that. But that's very frustrating to me on what hits mainstream media and what doesn't. And I feel that the industry itself has such a strong lobbying arm. It's very complicated in how, when it comes to violent video games, to your point, how that is linked into the CDC. I work with Dr. James Mercy there in terms of like their ability to do research on guns and violence, and that's attached to this gaming industry. So there's a lot of political issues on the back end that people don't recognize. So that's, to me, why we're not seeing more of it. But when you do get in and you look hindsight to kids that are on violent video games, it is bad. All bad.
Do you remember, I think it was 1997, there was a cartoon in Japan, a Nintendo Pokemon cartoon, and they had an explosion, a specific sequence of red, white, and yellow lights that flashed at 4.5 flashes per second. And all of a sudden, 729 Japanese kids ended up in emergency rooms with new onset seizures. And it was that study that for me went, okay, these things are not good. Because there's no neuroscience on, is this good for a developing brain or is it bad? There's no study on it that's published ahead of time. So we've unleashed these devices onto a developing population. And what we now know is the incidence of depression in teenagers is skyrocketing. The incidence of ADD has, more than tripled since 1992. And I think it's just incumbent upon us to look at, what's changing in our society besides taking fat out of our diet, which is a bad thing, putting these addictive devices in the hands of developing brains.
I agree. And besides, in addition to the idea of them being addictive to kids, you and I were having a conversation prior to us starting about the regulation and what people are allowed to put on there. What was the image that would pop up and give the message for kids to kill themselves?
Momo. There's controversy about whether that actually happened.
But my point is, and then there was the other one when my daughter was in grade school. She was in elementary school. There was Talking Tom, but then Talking Angela came out, and they got busted for actually viewing children, for peeping in on children. That one got shut down. So all of these things that some of them might be real, some of them not, but we know there's enough of it that is real, right? What do you do?
So I think we have to stop, but let's talk about the danger.
Right, and what do you do?
To children, and what do you do? The dangers of digital technology.
And how do you protect them?
Unplug is Dr. Strohman's book that you can get on Amazon. DCA Kids, so D as in dog, C as in Charlie, A as in apple, DCAkids.org. You can actually, I was looking this up, it was really cool, sign up for a program to actually learn how to, and Dr. Strohman's program will help you really do digital supervision on your kids. This is so important. If you have a child and you like the child, see, if you don't like the child, that's different. But if you like the child and you want to protect that child, this is just, it's just absolutely essential for you to look into this, DCAkids.org. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're here with Dr. Lisa Strohman, a clinical psychologist, author of the book Unplug, founder and director of Digital Citizen Academy, that you can learn more about at DCAkids.org. And I'm just fascinated by your work and, you know, how a young psychologist gets connected to the FBI. And you're studying these people who do really evil things and trying to understand them, but really the trauma that they can unleash on the world, especially to the most vulnerable of our population. What are the dangers, Lisa? You know, if you step back over your career over the last 20 years, what are the things that keep you up at night, that worry you about what's happening in our society?
Well, there's a lot. I don't sleep much because of the work that I do. But I will say that probably the biggest issue I see is that I think that we don't recognize as the adults in the room that when our children are attached to devices, that on a given day, that is a gateway into this other world. And so on a given day, you'll have 4.3 million people online that are accessing the same content, the same places. They're traversing those fields that your children are playing in. And you have, even just in the United States, we have about 1.2 million predators online every day that are seeking out pretty girls, vulnerable children, boys that might be angst, you know, like all of these things that we're looking at. And so I think I used to talk about stranger changer when I very, very first started. And now I talk about tricky people. It's the tricky people that know the technology better than we do, that can find, say, on Snapchat, they can go on to the Snap Map, and like we had a stalking case here where a stranger showed up outside of a 12-year-old's bedroom window, and they called the police, they caught the peeper, they brought him in, they pulled all of his devices, and then the police, literally, which is the team that I work with, had to go and knock on 16 other parents' doors and say, just want you to know that this guy has images of your child that you have no idea that he was taking through their windows. And I think that terrifies me.
I would have invited him in.
Well, Tana,
he was found outside that window. Good for him, anyways.
Yeah. So that's the part that I think that keeps me up at night, is understanding that you know, look, I'm not going to take my 12-year-old and drop her off at the gates of a stadium with 80,000 fans and strangers and say, I'll be back in 4 hours. Why, as parents, do we think it's okay to send them online with over 4 million people at a given time and think that something bad isn't going to happen? And to me, the only way to approach that is empower the children to understand the rules and understand the playgrounds that they're going into and the people that are there. And it's a balance between developmentally understanding. Is it a first grader that I'm going to talk about, you know, being helpful, inspiring, and kind online? Or is it going to be, you know, a middle schooler where I'm going to say, look, there's bad people in the world and you need to think about whether or not at 12, you're that interesting, because you're not going to have another 12-year-old talk to you for 3 hours because you're not that interesting. And so, how do you do that with kindness and with fun? Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Our daughter, our 16-year-old, thinks that we have effectively instilled, as you like to say, an anxiety disorder in her because she's terrified of everything.
I know, being a child of a psychologist that deals with
and a mother who's experienced enough stuff in the world, I'm brutally honest just about what can happen.
So what can parents do? What should parents do to protect their kids?
There's a lot that they can do. I think the number one thing that I talk to parents about is be present and don't love them so much that you miss it. I think that we all love our kids so much, and we want to trust that they're good and that they're smart and that they're making the best decisions that they can, obviously with developing brains, but don't miss those signs, those key signs. And the tricky part is, during puberty, during those years, that I always tell parents, I'm like, buckle up. It's going to be messy. It's going to be a bumpy ride. And they probably aren't going to like you for a little while, but stay present, pay attention to what they're doing. So that's the first thing that I tell them is the most important. And then the second one is do something online where you're monitoring and paying attention to what they are. There's tons of good programs out there. There's Thing, which is something that we talked about a little bit. There's Circle with Disney that you can do in the home. There's we partnered with Family Time on our program. So it's this app, there's apps out there and there's programs and units that you can have in your home that you can actually pay attention. And what I say is, like, treat your kids like Vegas, their technology use, and say to them, like, I'm going to check in just the way that your friends are checking in. And just because I think that you don't always know all the signs that maybe the adults do.
So I've a couple questions. You touched on, I want to touch on two things. You said, look for the signs. So I'd love for you to just recap that for our listeners. And these apps, obviously, I'm assuming that you have this conversation with your kids. Your kids know that you're on these apps.
Yes.
Well, and I just want to speak to this point. My kids might not like it. And what I've learned is when you supervise children, they don't like it. But they actually hate it more if you don't supervise them, because that means you don't care. So it's so critical to be their frontal lobes until theirs develop. And your job is not to be their friend.
It's to be their parent.
Friendship comes great, but it's to supervise them and to keep them safe and developing in a safe way. It's like, my child said, well, I really want to play football. The answer is no. And it's like, well, but I really want to. And it's like, well, if you really wanted to do cocaine, the answer is still no, because I know it's a brain damaging sport. But a digital addiction is damaging as well. And it can damage this very important part of your brain called the nucleus accumbens that helps you feel joy, that helps you feel pleasure, and also damage your frontal lobes. So you're going to be more vulnerable to addiction of cocaine and heroin and alcohol and cigarettes if you don't take care of often a child's first addiction, which is a digital addiction.
Yeah, it's one thing that you said that's really interesting. So we have a pretty good teenager. She was really hellion as a kid, but she's 16. So she's starting to push on things. And so I, as you said, buckled up for one thing recently. And I was like, oh, here we go. I just knew it was going to be, just a nightmare. And that was one of those moments where you're not a friend. And it was like, this is how it's going to be. You're not coming home at 1:00. This is going to be your curfew. This is how it's going to go. And I was just ready. And she did the whole, I think a lot of kids do this, but why? I don't understand. And when I said, she's like, I'm not doing anything bad. And I said, it's okay if you don't understand. You don't need to understand. My job is to keep you safe because I love you. And shockingly, she backed down. So I think a lot of parents are ready for their kids to just flip out, and some kids will. But she actually came and she goes, okay, I do understand. I understand. I love you. I don't want to worry you. And I think that if you keep it up, for a lot of kids, they actually do understand. They just want to see how far they can go. But they do like having some boundaries around them. They feel safer. And they don't want to be they don't want to look like the nerd or the bad guy with their friends. It's better if the parent is the bad guy. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with being the bad guy.
You are.
Yeah, I'm fine. Yeah.
Well, and it's not necessarily being the bad guy. I think it's an excellent point that you bring up, that the boundaries that they need, they don't know yet. Right. And so it is your job to parent. And I think, I don't know how many different talk shows I've been on, and I get an applaud from the audience from just making that statement. And I think, no, that's it's not applaudable. Like, everybody should be doing that. We should just be parents, and we should understand that it's not my job to make you happy.
Nope.
And make your job, it's to be a kid and to understand that I'm in control.
Yes. I will applaud that. Yes.
Thank you.
Because people think it's their job to make their kids happy.
Right. And it really isn't. And the digital space with these technology and these devices is, like my daughter's in 7th grade now, and she doesn't have any devices. Oh, and she said to me, and I said to her, I said, here's the parameters. Of course, she's grown up with me, so I have a huge jar of money for therapy, because I know she'll need it.
Exactly. That's what I always say. I'll pay for your therapy.
Right. But my reality is like, I've given her the truth since she was little about, here's the reality, here's the issues, here's the situation. And I've got 2 kids, 15 months apart. My son he pushes the boundaries. Like, he definitely will come in. He's like, I want to play this game because my friends are all on this game. And so one of the games he wanted to play was Roblox. And my daughter's like, you realize that that's going to put your brain into mush. Like he's ridiculous or even wanting it. And I said, well, let's have a conversation. Let's sit down. Let me talk to you about a few of the cases. And he literally covers his ears and he's like, please don't tell me that there's bad people on this. And I was like, well, as a matter of fact, let's talk about, so, but it's giving them a part of like some of the why and some of the line, right? All of the line, some of the why. Right. Right. And I think that what's changed with me is like, my daughter walks around again, terrified, a little bit more too terrified, but she'll say these devices like basically track us everywhere we're going. You're dropping me off at a school that you trust. I know that I can go and use the phone in the office at any time. I think it's ridiculous that I need to have that. So I think that that's important for parents to recognize. It's like, if you're paying for private school or you're doing tutoring, you're doing all of these things, where your kids are. Like, why do you need to have personal attachment to them at 8, 9, 10? Like, to me, it's a bit silly. I get when they're 16, they're starting to travel the world and they're starting to drive. And, when they get older, there's a lot of other things that they need to understand. How do I use this as a tool? And that's one of the biggest signs I will tell you're asking me about is if your child is being used by technology and your child is not using technology, that is a huge sign.
Wow.
I like that. Powerful. That's really important.
All right. When we come back, we're going to talk about more practical tips. And we should also talk a little bit about adult digital addictions because they're everywhere. Stay with us.
We are back and we're still here with our friend, Dr. Lisa Strohman, and her book, Unplug. And I'm loving this topic. This is just so good. I'm actually learning a lot. This is amazing. So thank you for being here with us. It's really validating a lot of what I've felt and thought over the years, especially for parents who are not staying connected with their kids and paying attention to what's going on in their worlds. And you touched on something in the last episode. In this episode, I'd really love for you to give us more tips, practical tips, but also address one thing. You talked about why do kids need technology if you are dropping them off, if they're with a tutor, if you know where they're at. But not all parents know where their kids are at, and not all kids feel secure in their environment. So what do we do about those situations? I was a latchkey kid. We didn't have phones back then. But what about those situations?
Because of that, you actually had an anxiety disorder.
It's severe.
When she was 9, her mom sometimes wouldn't come home, and she'd end up calling the bars and trying to hunt her down, and you actually drove a number of bartenders crazy.
Yeah, well, 24-hour restaurants. Yeah. So we didn't have phones back then. I used a landline, but what do you do for those kids who are latchkey kids, who walk themselves home, who don't have the perfect environment at home, who come from broken homes and parents are fighting and not letting them call? And do you know what I mean? Like those types of situations. What do you say to that?
Excellent point on that situation, because I think that we have more and more families that are divorcing, or you have kids that are coming from fosters, or you have these kids that need some sort of belief or comfort that they have somebody looking up over them.
Right.
So again, that goes back to, if the kid's using it as a tool whereby they're like, I'm feeling uncomfortable in this situation because there's a stranger in front of me, or I'm uncomfortable in the situation because I got home and one of the windows was open. I'm going to call. I'm just going to walk myself through the house while I have an adult on the phone that I trust. Excellent use of the phone. If they're using it because they're not learning that internal locus of control. So in psychology, there's external locus of control and internal. External is everything around me is in control and makes me feel better. The things inside of me don't. So that's the balance or the line there. And again, it's divorcing parents. You want to understand, your child needs to still learn how to internally manage themselves. And so don't let it get that far. Where you feel like you're kind of beholden to your child to answer the call so they feel better, and just pay attention as a parent to that. But it's an excellent point that I think a lot of kids need some sort of security in these transitioning times with them. And it's still our job as the adults in the room to teach them how to have that internal fortitude, grit, get them into that place where they feel confident inside themselves.
That. Yeah. And I like what you said about, are they using it as a tool or are they being used? And that's pretty important. That makes sense to me.
Well, it completely fits with the evil ruler concept in the end of mental illness, or the fact that you're in a war for the health of your brain,
all
but
of
also
these companies
the
like
brains of the
Apple
kids.
saying, do you mind if we track your location? And yes, I mind. Why do they need to track my even the apartment, building that we have up in LA? Can we track your location? No. Why do you need to track my location? Why does everybody need to track your location? It's crazy.
We don't.
Right.
Well, they sell it.
So let's
yeah.
let's do tips. Based on your extensive experience, and we have 7 minutes, give us as many tips as you can that our Brain Warrior families can start to implement. The first one is be aware that you said. What else can they do?
The second thing is sit down with your kids. And that's why I always give this free trial out, because I think you sit down with your kids and go through the key concepts of where they are developmentally. Do they understand the terms of service? Do they understand what it means when you say yes to downloading an app? Do they understand that there's a geolocation service based on each one of these apps, right? Our kids feel like there's a lot of things that are free in this world because of technology. And the adults typically understand that that's not true. Everything is an exchange. Everything is a transaction. And so if we're giving ourselves an app or a free trial of an app on technology, they're typically taking something from us, whether it's our facial recognition data, whether it's our tracking location, and they resell it. So that's how they're making their money, or they're advertising to us. So get the terms of service would be the second thing, is sit down with your kids and say, do you really understand what this means? Because I think kids, of course, depending on their age, they're smart enough to understand this. And I will tell you, Tana, for your 16-year-old, you sit down and you go through the terms of service of Instagram or TikTok. Oh, absolutely. It's a global license that they're giving away that they can resell, and their image can be on billboards anywhere in the world, and they never have to tell her. That's frustrating.
I didn't even know that. That's crazy.
Absolutely true. Yeah. So one of the app presentations I do, they can take it and you license them on all of them to take it and resell it. They can even modify it. So if they want to change her face, her body,
oh no, I think the whole world is watching me all the time.
Oh, I do too. I'm convinced of it. Everybody's watching.
When Edward Snowden came out and said the CIA is basically watching everything you do.
Yeah.
I'm like, well,
my life's not that interesting.
When you grow up Roman Catholic, I grew up seriously Roman, you think God is watching and judging everything you do.
But it's
so it's now God, the government.
I'm fine having God watch me.
Apple,
everyone else,
Google.
I'm not so sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Just part of it.
But I give up. It's I know they're watching, so I'm just gonna give them a big mood or something.
More tips.
So mood changes. So this is a challenging one. With littler kids, elementary school. So I'll kind of break it down. Elementary school, you start to see mood swings. You start to see friend group changes, or you start to see grades shift at that elementary school age. That shouldn't be happening there. So that's a huge sign.
Online bullying happened to my niece in 4th grade.
It's a real thing that people, again, kids don't know how to talk about it. And when they do talk about it, parents freak out and they take their technology away. So guess what? Kids don't talk about it.
You teach them to lie.
Right. So that's the challenge of like with our kiddos of like, so that elementary school age, you shouldn't be seeing those massive mood swings. You shouldn't see in that. When you get to middle school to about sophomore in high school, that's when I tell parents, like, the wheels come off the bus. You're going to have to like belt in and like really kind of prepare, because mood swings, like, them telling you that they hate you, that their friends are more important, they don't want anything to do with you. That's all pretty normal. But it's exacerbated by technology, because if you allow them in the bedroom and you allow them to shut the door, to me, that's as bad as letting them get on a field with a football in a helmet.
So what should parents
a dangerous
do
part.
with, because a lot of kids when they're 10, 11, 12 do get phones, and they often will keep them at night. So what is your thought is when you go to bed, the phone needs to be in my room?
There should be a central charging station. As parents, we should role model. We should not have our cell phone in our room. There's absolutely no reason why people are sleeping with their phones at night. Kids are not trauma surgeons that need to be woken up at 2 a.m. because there's some like a crisis in the world. There's a minute amount of people in this world that need to be able to answer
and
the
it
phone
should be on silence
in the middle
anyways.
of the night.
Yeah,
I always say again, like people are like, oh, I need it for my alarm. Really? They're like $4.99 at Target at this point. So there's no reason that you need to have your phone next to your bed. It is, in adult couples, it is absolutely a wedge that goes in between couples, because we're looking at our feeds, like we're like paying attention, we're reading articles, like whatever it is that we want to give excuses for. It is not what we should be doing, and we shouldn't be role modeling that for our kids. They need that sleep. It is priority number one for developing brains, is getting them sleep, nutrition, all of those things.
Could not agree with you more.
I think
all right,
you're sounding a little too much.
He wants to change the subject. No, he wants to change the subject.
I heard central charging station.
Don't sleep with your phone.
Don't sleep with your phone. I actually read myself to sleep. So but I have blue light blocker
and leaves it on the bed.
My phone.
It drives me crazy. I throw it off the bed because it just drives me crazy. It's the mistress. I call it the mistress. I call the phone the mistress. Drives me insane.
I would say try it for a week. What a great Christmas present, holiday present, right? But give it a present, give a week without technology in your bedroom and see how things change.
Get the mistress out of the bedroom. Did you hear her? I heard it.
So another
both
tip
leaving
for
me
kids.
Speechless. All right, other tips.
I'm never going to be invited back.
No, you are for sure.
Another thing I think with kids is to recognize is when you see them changing like weight rapidly. And again, that this is hard because of puberty and like that age.
They're not moving.
But it's like that, yeah. So they're not moving as much. They're not active as much. So again, I always say if you're going to allow your child access to technology, then counterbalance it with something. So are they doing a musical instrument? Are they doing activity? Are they doing a sport? So in my house, real sports before fake sports. You absolutely get no technology time on the weekends. We don't do any technology Monday through Thursday. Weekends we allow it, but it's only if you're engaged in a real sport. So you have to be on a team sport or participating sport, and you have to have done your music every day during the week, because I know that helps build neuronal structures in their brains and what they need to do. So
it's interesting. You and I were talking about this before we started. Our daughter, she started noticing it in probably 8th grade, that when she spends a lot of time on her phone, it's proportionate. She starts to not feel well. She starts to feel anxious. She's very anxious anyways. So she starts to feel anxious. She starts to feel depressed. She starts to compare herself to other people. And she pointed that out to me, and which we've been telling her forever. But she actually then fortunately notices it. And so she started limiting herself, which I thought was fantastic, which, we would anyways. But she did it to herself, like to an extreme, which I thought was amazing. So she would stay connected to her friends, but she wouldn't really spend a lot of extra time surfing through Instagram and stuff like that. So I thought that was actually really interesting that she would notice that it made her feel bad.
We're going to have to stop. But Lisa, tell people how they can learn more about your work and how they can use that to protect themselves and their children.
I would encourage the listeners to go to dcakids.org. We are 100% behind parents, families, kids, of understanding how to manage balance, have healthy relationships with technology, how to use it as a tool and not have it use you. That's our platform, and that's what we try to do every day at dcakids.org.
Wow, this has been so informative, even for me. I learned a lot.
Awesome.
This was great.
Thank you so much. We'll look forward to having you back after we have this discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. If you're enjoying the Brain Warriors Way podcast, please don't forget to subscribe so you'll always know when there's a new episode. And while you're at it, feel free to give us a review or 5-star rating, as that helps others find the podcast.
If you're considering coming to Amen Clinics or trying some of the brain healthy supplements from BrainMD, you can use the code podcast10 to get a 10% discount on a full evaluation at amenclinics.com or a 10% discount on all supplements at brainmdhealth.com. For more information, give us a call at 855-978-1363.